Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds, a very superheroic edition. On this episode, glad to be talking with legendary comics creator Richard Cumley. Richard, thank you for joining.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely, absolutely. People out there will know you for a particular character named Captain Canuck. Am I saying that correctly?
For somebody from North Carolina, it's
Thank
just
you.
fine. But up here, they'll say Canuck.
Canuck. Okay. All right. All right. Emphasis on the second syllable. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Schwa syllable. Gotcha. Okay. Well, Captain Canuck. And of course, that character's gone through a couple of different iterations. It's had quite the journey. So,
Yeah.
delighted to talk about your history there and what makes comics this special space for you where you enjoy creating.
Well, I really wasn't into comic books when I started Captain Canuck. As a kid, I can remember going to a neighbor's place and seeing comic books, Dennis the Menace, Tarzan, war comics, and I was probably 6 years old, and I first saw a comic book illustrated by Joe Kubert,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I remember liking it even way back then. You know what I mean? Liking his artwork. I like to draw, and of course, anybody who likes to draw will be attracted to sequential art.
Yeah.
Comic books, and I the only comic book work I did that I can remember is during high school. I had a classmate. His name is Ken Kazuka, and
Hmm.
because Kazuka rhymes with bazooka, he became Bazooka Man.
Nice.
So, and his nose would turn into a bazooka, and it was a formidable weapon when it transformed. So, anyways, but yeah, I started Captain Canuck. I started thinking about it in 1971. A friend by the name of Ron Leishman, who I consider the co-creator, I want to point out he didn't do any of the work, but if it wouldn't have been for him, I wouldn't have done it. He was the one who said there should be a Canadian superhero, and we talked about it for a couple of years. And I didn't really get serious about it until about 73. I started to think more seriously about it. And I started looking into, the distribution, the publishing, the printing, all the aspects, you know what I mean,
Hmm.
of publishing. And I had considered, in fact, I did a 4-page sampler and I sent to Harlequin Romance in Toronto, Ontario,
Hmm.
and they were interested. Interestingly, an editor came to see me in Winnipeg, which is where I was. I learned recently that Harlequin actually started in Winnipeg, in
Oh,
the
huh.
city of Winnipeg. And yeah, we were talking about weather. I've talked to Americans sometimes, especially Americans like from Texas and places like that. And I remember being in an airport and talking to somebody, and I told them where I was I grew up,
Hmm.
Winnipeg, and where is that? North of North Dakota, and that's when I get the wow, wow, you live there. And I got to tell them some winter stories, how it goes to 40 below and all of that stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh, no, anyways, I I started, working on plans starting around 73. And in 74, I got serious about it, started working on it. Um, and then the first issue came out in 1975. But this was all new to me. Learning how
Hmm.
to write and illustrate comic books. It was all the first issue. It's hard to look at now, and it definitely got better. Second issue was already better. Third issue was already better. By then, I had George Freeman on board. He did the inking, and then he did the pencils and inks, starting with issue number 4. Except I had to do 5 and 6, and he was back on it, and so yeah, it and it's been I'm in the midst of writing a book called the Captain and I.
Love it, love it.
Yeah,
Great.
and it's basically an autobiography and the history of Captain Canuck. So And I'm getting close to the end. It's probably going to be about a 350-page book because there's going to be a lot of images, a lot of illustrations, and a lot of
Mhm.
photos included in the book.
I
Uh,
was going to ask, I know there's an anniversary for the character this year
yep.
from yeah, what you've shared with me. And so I was going to ask about what you were envisioning next for the character as well as for comics in general. So lovely that you're telling this story in prose form.
Yeah. Well, I I am kind of doing less and less. I have been. There's lots of other artists and lots of other writers have worked on Captain Canuck editions, but this year, being the 50th anniversary, I've convinced George Freeman and Claude Saint-Aubin, who
Hmm.
the other artist who came to work with me, that the three of us will do an issue again. And all these years later, we did in 2014. We did a summer special,
Hmm.
and George and Claude and I worked together on those stories, the two stories in that, and so that was the first time in 33 years that we had worked together on a comic book.
Wow,
So,
wow.
yeah, and I've stayed in touch with them, of course. They when I first started doing Captain Canuck, it was a one man show. I was doing everything,
Hmm.
and then George came along, and and as soon as I saw his work, I said, oh, please, and yeah, and then Claude came along. I don't know, 4 months later or something like that, and Claude spoke very little English,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
He's from Quebec. He came from Montreal, and yeah, I he was literally uh, on my front lawn. He was playing catch with my brother Tim, who was about 12 at the time, and he came up to me and says, "I come to help you with the comic," and that was about six of the 14 words of English that he knew.
Hmm.
So, anyways, it worked out great.
Those are the words you want to hear, and you spoke the common language of comics.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And Claude and George have gone on to work for Marvel, DC, a bunch of other publishers. You know what I mean? Claude is more or less retired now. George less so. George has been doing a lot of storyboarding for film in the
Mm-hmm.
last 10 years or something like that. So
Yeah. No. I know that there's an extraterrestrial sort of science fiction aspect to the character, which I guess a lot of superhero characters have something science fiction about them in one way or another. Are there particular influences that you point back to as you were developing the character?
uh, I hadn't read a lot of comic books
Hmm.
up to that point, and so I of course Joe Kubert was an influence. Nestor Redondo, as an artist, I
Hmm.
still think he was one of the very best.
Hmm.
And he's been dead a few years now. So is Joe Kubert, but excuse me. But as far as writing, um, I didn't read a lot of them, so it was. I think I would have probably done a better job if I had done a little more work at that end. You know what I mean? There's one writer, I think his name is Micheline, and
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
um, he's written for Marvel or DC.
Yeah.
DC, I think mostly.
Hmm.
Anyways, and I think he's still working, even maybe, or
I
yeah,
think he does some. Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, that's one writer I remember, and in fact, I think I even wrote to him way back then. He never replied, but I mean, you know, But people at DC were good to me when I went there in 1975. After the second issue, I went to New York to try to make a deal with a licensing agency there that also represented DC Comics.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and I also met Neil Adams at that time too. I just literally walked into his studio and he was working on a game box illustration. But yeah, and Joe and Neil Adams was, somebody I liked who his art as well.
Hmm.
Not
Hmm.
as much as Joe Kubert, but I still, he was still a really good illustrator.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there have been a couple of iterations of the character, a couple of sort of turns in the story. Any particular part that you look back on especially fondly? We talked a little bit about the origin of the character, but any
Yeah.
chapter?
Well, just to review the original origin, it's Tom Evans.
Hmm.
He and his brother become Mounties, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and his and he, Tom Evans is also a scout leader. He takes the scouts out, troop out for wilderness camp. They're sleeping in their tents, and the aliens come along. And as aliens like to do, they like to examine the species.
Hmm. Hmm.
And apparently, there's people who swear that they've been examined by aliens. I mean, and they sound pretty darn credible when you listen to them. So, but one of the aliens, just kind of zaps Tom Evans, and just shouldn't have really done that, but kind of thing. And of course, they all wake up. They have no memory of what's happened because that's what aliens do. You know,
Hmm.
they examine you and then whatever, and then zap. You won't remember this, buddy. And so, and then when he is tested, well, next he gets recruited into an organization called CISO,
Hmm.
which was kind of like a Canadian version of the CIA, sort of. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that CSIS is the Canadian equivalent to the CIA. It's called, and CSIS was formed exactly 10 years after the first issue of Captain Canuck. So I often like to point out that government people are really slow to pick up on an idea. But anyhow, so that's the original story, and then eventually he starts to remember the aliens, and then in the series he has basically a confrontation with some of the aliens, and that was in the original, what I refer to as the original series that started in 1975 and ended in late 1979, or yeah, sorry, no, late 1980 is when it basically stopped. 15 issues. Uh, well, actually, 16 issues were done, but number 15 there was a summer special, so and then wasn't actually published. They didn't publish it until 2005.
Hmm.
Just the way things worked out. But yeah, excuse me. The thing about comics is words and pictures,
Hmm.
and it's
Hmm.
the thing that I think is special about comic books is that you know the artwork. Most people who read comic books enjoy the artwork.
Yeah.
They enjoy particular artists. Of course, they enjoy particular writers too. But it's an interesting combination. You know what I mean? It's sort of halfway between book and moving pictures.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
and yeah, and anybody who draws is attracted to sequential art.
Yeah.
Stories told with pictures. So yeah.
No, no, you've written, drawn, lettered. Is there a particular joy that you find in one of those areas, or are they all equal opportunity engagement?
Yeah, I mean, once George came on board, I focused on the writing and the lettering.
Hmm. Hmm.
We all did the work on the coloring together because back then I came up with a method thanks to Dick Thomas, a fellow who did color separations. We came up with a method that other publishers also used, and that was you got to remember this is long before computers, and so we were coloring on an acetate overlay that was placed over top of the line art.
Mm,
And
mhm,
then we use the same paint that animators use, and they paint cells. You know what I mean? With this
mhm,
a vinyl acrylic polymer paint is what it is, and so and it was and it, the advantage of this method was that it gave us lots of latitude. You know, tones, any colors we wanted. You know what I mean? With the method that all the other publishers were using at that time, you had a choice of 49 colors, and that included black and white. And you know what I mean? So
mhm, mhm.
your skin colors were all the same. It was 25% magenta and 25% yellow. Everybody got that's what their skin color was. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So, anyways, so that was the, and then so I tended to focus more on the writing at that time because George, both Claude and I looked up to George. We still do, we
Yeah, yeah,
still, as far as his drawing skills are concerned, and uh, it just seemed to work better that way. So
yeah, yeah. Well, I know, as I mentioned, there's an anniversary for the character, and I'm looking forward to the book that you're working on. Looking forward to reading that. Uh, Anything that you envision next in the world of comics, and then as a second part to the question, anywhere where people can go, expect to see you or connect in some way with the character.
well, what is next for Captain Canuck? That's kind of out of my hands now. It's
Hmm.
really in the hands of Lev Gleason Publishing, and
Hmm.
and I
Hmm.
don't know, their publishing plans until sort of after they've set them. Now I
Yeah.
work with them still, and but I'm doing, like I said, for the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. I've been doing less and less. I've done a few special editions. One edition that I particularly did like was in 2017. I did a, a, a book for Crime Stoppers, which is
Mm-hmm.
all over the world now. And we did and I wrote it. Tom Grummett, you probably know that name.
Hmm. Hmm.
He penciled it, and then George and I inked it,
Nice.
and George and his wife colored it. And I think George and Lori did the lettering because nowadays it's all done on computer. All the lettering is done on computer. There's very, very, very few. I don't know if anybody's doing it by hand anymore.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but as far as what's coming next, and broadly speaking, in the whole industry, well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but uh, Diamond is in Chapter 11.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
probably knew that. So
Yeah.
it's going to be now. There's other distributors out there, and of course, a lot of all the smaller publishers are trying to, line up with one of them. And but it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds.
Yeah.
Whether Diamond, is able to survive Chapter 11, it remains to be seen. But there's all kinds of. I read an article, and there's all kinds of possibilities and all kinds of possible buyers for Diamond, who will then, restructure or whatever and carry on. So that
Yeah.
remains to be seen. But it's a tough industry. It's
Hmm.
electronics is so predominant in the world today. Small handheld devices,
Hmm.
and of course you can read your comic books on those devices, laptops, iPads, your phone, etc.
Hmm.
It's not the same. It's not the same experience to hold
True.
that paper product in your hand, but it's there's lots of people still enjoy reading their comic books that way. You
Yeah.
know, so
Oh, I love the vitality for creators when there can be, and local comic shops being part of that equation
yeah,
as well,
yeah,
and the accessibility of comics, which is just unheard of now, as opposed to when I was growing up. They were, you could find them sometimes, but not that often and consistently. So hopefully there are some good channels moving forward for those things to continue.
yeah. When I first started Captain Canuck in 1975, my only real option was mass market newsstand distribution.
Hmm.
There were
Hmm.
a few comic book stores. I think there was four in Canada, and there was probably half a dozen in the United States. And then by another 10, 15 years, that it was in the hundreds. There was hundreds of comic book specialty stores. I don't know when it peaked. It probably peaked around the late 80s, and
Yeah.
now it's come down a bit. You know what I mean? The numbers of special, there's probably, I don't know, there's over 2,000. There's maybe 2,500 comic book stores in North America, something like that now. At one
Yeah.
time, it was more than double that.
Yeah.
But
Wild things. Wild things.
yeah.
Um, but that last part of the question was where people can go, where they can find out more about you online, in person, and any of the above.
Well, Comely Art is my website, and that site has a bit about me, but it's mostly images.
Hmm.
There's some Captain Canuck images on there, but a variety of images. Some are from work I've done in the past, but I license those images. There's an agency in the States there that handles the licensing. I don't make very much money from it, but it's nice to see artwork that you've done get a second use.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's already done, and you're getting a little bit more money for it. You know what I mean? For that same illustration, it's always nice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It, so that's and there's I don't know, 200 images on there, 150 to 200 images, and like I said, it's a real variety of images, and some of it's from other work. I've worked as a commercial artist for much of my life, doing children's books, a lot of advertising, a lot of editorial, all of that kind of stuff, and so that's where a lot of that stuff comes from.
Yeah.
Some of it's fairly old, not that anybody could tell what's new and what's old, but some of those images were done, 40 years ago, and
Oh,
they're on the site, and some of them get licensed because it just fits what that company or that website or that publisher needs.
yeah.
So that's why it's great to have a lot of variety available. Now,
Nice.
Lev Gleason, LEVGLEASON
Hmm.
uh, .com is Lev Gleason Publishing. Now that name Lev Gleason, that was a publisher back in the 40s and 50s. He was a comic book publisher back then, long gone now.
Hmm.
And Fatty decided I don't know that he wanted to, not sure why actually, but he decided he wanted to rename the company after Lev Gleason. And he published a lot of stuff, and they were the pretty standard comic books for the time.
Hmm.
But he was outside, you know what I mean. He wasn't Marvel, he wasn't DC, and which Fatty isn't either. So I guess he felt a kinship with the late Lev Gleason.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So there are some spaces to go to, definitely.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, levegleason.com, and of course, and I believe there's a CaptainCanuck.com again too. There was an animated web series that won an
Hmm.
award that's available online, and you just have to punch in Captain Canuck, and it'll probably come up without even putting in the words web series.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of fun. That it's only 5 episodes. The story arc is covered with 5 3-minute episodes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so that's there. And you know, there's the other thing that I'm looking forward to seeing in print is I did a newspaper strip. It only ran on 11 newspapers. It was a Captain Canuck newspaper strip. I did a total of 415 daily strips,
Hmm.
and those 415 strips covered 5 stories. So it's a
Wow.
continuity strip. So the stories, one story would end, and the next would just the very after that story ends, next day it's a whole new story, and it just they kind of morph into each other. Sometimes, in a few cases, there is a kind of a beginning point with a title for the story, and in other kinds, it more or less kind of just moves on into the next story. Life
Hmm. Hmm.
goes on, kind of thing.
Nice, nice. Well, anything that we've missed in the talk through that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
Um, well, the 50th anniversary. I want to remind people it is the
Hmm.
50th anniversary. Um, if any of your listeners are frequent a comic book store, it'd be lovely if they say to the owner, "Do you have Captain Canuck?" And if you don't, go to Lev Gleason because you can get them from there. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
The,
Hmm.
the distribution system right now, because of Diamond's situation, is a little sketchy. Best to order directly from the publisher, that kind of thing. So, and some of those issues, for example, that Crime Stopper story, which turned out really well. I mean, Tom Grummett did a great, and George Zell did a great job, and it had a very large print run. 218,000
Hmm.
copies were printed, but it was not distributed in the United States.
Hmm.
So there's not very many copies that have gotten down there. Of course, a few have gotten down there. Store got them somewhere. You know what I mean? In a few cases, that's probably maybe 10 stores in total at the most, kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Hmm.
So that would be, and I know there's copies to be had, even at Liv Gleason. He's got a little bit of a supply of them. He's probably got 50 copies or something. So and the nice thing about that issue, it's a one-off, so
Hmm.
there's no continuation. The story is told within those pages. I don't 24 pages, I think it is, something like that. Yeah,
Nice.
and the other thing is, I hope you weren't. I don't know your political leanings,
No.
but you've noticed that illustration of Captain Canuck, I would say, chastising your new president.
Yes, I'm not offended at all.
Okay.
I'm
Well,
not offended at all.
I don't know if you're aware that there's certain levies being laid upon, well, the Mexican and the Canadian government, and
Hmm.
people are
Hmm.
not happy about it at all. I don't know how the Mexicans feel, but I know a lot of Canadians are not happy with what's happening. These levies, tons of levies, and so there's you saw the illustration. I think Captain Canuck
Hmm.
is shaking his finger at Trump, and uh, there you go. So
Yeah.
I have friends in United States and in Canada who are Trump fans. I'm not particularly a Trump
Hmm.
fan,
Hmm.
but um, hey, we're all, it's a free country, for heaven's sakes. We're all entitled to support,
Absolutely.
and lots of people obviously supported Trump because he is the president. He got elected. So there you go.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great history of comics heroes and political commentary for sure.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I appreciate that as well.
Yeah. And Captain Canuck made a lot of commentary, political and otherwise, in issues that were focused really on Canadian stories too. So we've got
Yeah.
we got lots of people. We got crazy people up here too. So
Another thing we have in common, absolutely.
yeah.
Superheroes and the people they fight for and against, and yeah, all of those things.
Yeah.
Well, delight to talk with you. I'm glad to have you back anytime, and certainly glad to be talking about the character on this anniversary year, and glad to share about your work anytime at all.
Thank you. Thanks for
Absolutely.
having me.
Anytime.